Resident Evil is a powerhouse, a juggernaut, a giant in the gaming space. Its history allows it to, slightly inaccurately, lay claim to the survival horror genre as a whole. It is the single most popular video game horror franchise to date, with a variety of numbered entries, spin-offs, adaptations, novels, and comics. It is a titan that refuses to fall with the ebb and flow of the market or time. It stands resilient. And with that in mind, this series has managed to mostly pass me by over the years. I've played an entry here or there, put a few hours into some of the recent games, played the originals when I was a kid, but I never really took the time to dive into its depths. Having now played the first game in the series multiple times, I can safely say that I get it now. Resident Evil as a game and not a franchise is imperfect. It has blemishes, marks that cover something that is aspiring to be and would become a piece of chiseled marble. Its design is impeccable, particularly in environments. Weaving hallways and narrow passages drift purposefully through a home that's easy to get lost in. The pre-rendered backgrounds leave nothing to the imagination, implying little and showing everything. But this game is supposed to be the father of the survival horror genre, and if a survival horror game is supposed to scare, then Resident Evil scares incredibly well. The fear and horror come not only from the monsters that we face, but they permeate the very mechanics that the game insists that you interact with. The horror comes not only from staring down an infected creature and having the guts to pull the trigger, but from the bowels of the game itself. Resident Evil has fear and tension woven into it like stitching put into a fine fabric, a virus that has attached itself to the DNA of the thing and manages to become one with it. It is inescapable. Though elementary at this point in the series, Resident Evil's story is simple and strong. With solid themes and characters that promise more to come, it keeps you interested and never takes itself too seriously. Resident Evil is a special piece of history, marking the beginning of one of the most popular and successful gaming franchises ever, but it's also special on its own. Many people have already talked about the series over the years, and as I write this review, I am plenty aware of that, but after becoming enamored with the first entry and doing everything I can to immerse myself in its world, I set the goal of trying to bring something new to this discussion. So that's what I'm going to do today, as I talk about 1996's Resident Evil. I'll be talking about gameplay, story, mechanics, and everything in between. If you enjoy the video, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps me out. You can also follow me over on Patreon, where I provide updates, early access to my videos, and extra content from time to time. It's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about Resident Evil. The story of Resident Evil doesn't quite begin with Capcom, but a film director named Kiyoshi Kurosawa. Kurosawa was an up-and-coming director in the Japanese film scene and directed projects like Kandagawa Pervert Wars and 1985's The Excitement of the Do-Re-Mi-Fa Girl. Though Kurosawa's popularity would not truly begin to surge until the early 90s, our focus here lands on a less assuming project in the form of Sweet Home. Sweet Home was the title of a 1989 film that Kurosawa wrote and directed. Distributed by Toho, the film centered around a film crew exploring the mansion of a famous painter and documenting their findings. This heroic journey is fraught with setbacks from the start, with the crew being denied entry into Mamiya's mansion. The place is said to be cursed, but the crew makes their way inside anyways and comes to find that this curse is real. The mansion turns out to be a sprawling place, dilapidated and filled with enemies around every corner, but they find what they're looking for, the paintings of Mamiya. The film is full of striking special effects and vicious imagery. It isn't what I would call a masterpiece, but it is the start of this story. That's because as the film was being developed, so was a video game adaptation of the same name. The game was even advertised in trailers for the film. It's clear that the goal was to generate more interest by creating a second way of experiencing this horror piece. The game, Sweet Home, for the NES, was published by Capcom and was released almost a full year after the release of the film. The director of the game, Tokaru Fujiwara, had worked with Kurosawa on the game's development. He was allowed to tour the film studio that the team used and was ultimately given freedom to change the story the way that he wanted to. Sweet Home sees us playing the team of 5 characters exploring the Mamiya Mansion. It's a JRPG in the classic sense and requires full collaboration from the different members of the team to explore the mansion effectively. Fujiwara had mostly developed coin-operated arcade games up to this point. This was one of his first forays into the home console market, and he was pretty unimpressed with the graphical capabilities of the Famicom at the time. What exactly does this have to do with Resident Evil? Well, if Resident Evil is one of the fathers of the survival horror genre, then Sweet Home is the primordial ooze that Resident Evil was birthed from. Though truly that ooze consists of more than just Sweet Home, it is the only game that is directly connected to Resident Evil's development. Around the time that Sweet Home was released, another developer had just started working at Capcom. Shinji Mikami was around 25 years old when he started working at the company. A friend of his had invited him to a buffet/job fair that Capcom was holding. Mikami only showed up for the free food, but in talking to the people there, he became so interested that he decided to interview for a position and got it. This simple decision would drastically change the fate of the survival horror genre and video games as a whole. Mikami would work mostly on Disney games for his first 3 years at the company. Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the Game Boy was released in 1991 to little fanfare, but Goof Troop for the Super Nintendo was where Mikami would really start to hit his stride. Positive reception and good sales meant he was moving up in the company. Disney's Aladdin for the same system in 1993 would be another step up for the fledgling developer and a ticket to finally working on something new. This juxtaposition in development titles has clearly been noted before. How does one go from making animated Disney games to attempting to create the scariest game ever made? An article in issue 91 of GamePro magazine states it thus. What do Resident Evil's bloody butchery and macabre mutants share in common with the bouncy Super NES games Aladdin and Goof Troop? It's hard to imagine, but the 2 cheerful cartoon romps in the wickedly compelling Resident Evil were concocted by the same creative minds, Capcom's Shinji Mikami and his game development team in Osaka, Japan. So how did this transition happen? It happened during a meeting in 1993 at Capcom's Osaka development studio. Fujiwara had become interested in remaking Sweet Home. He had never been happy with the graphical capabilities in the Famicom system and wanted some form of retribution. He wanted to remake Sweet Home, but for modern systems with updated graphics. He invited Mikami to direct the game, but Mikami wasn't exactly thrilled to be working on a horror title. He didn't like things that scared him, but Fujiwara took this as a good sign that he made the right choice. People who aren't afraid of anything don't understand what's frightening. In my view, you can't make a horror game if you don't have any fear. While Fujiwara wanted to make a remake of Sweet Home, Capcom wanted new IP, so Sweet Home became Resident Evil. Clearly, a lot of the original premise can be felt in the Resident Evil that we would get, a horror story set in a mansion as characters are picked off one by one. Striking visuals and horrific imagery were the key that bound these 2 projects together. It wasn't just the setting or tone, though, that would be lifted from Sweet Home. Many of the foundational gameplay elements that Resident Evil was known for came from that primordial ooze. Before this name change, though, the game was just referred to as Horror Game internally. The game was also originally planned for the SNES, but due to the system limitations and the release of the Sony PlayStation soon after, this end goal would be changed. At the beginning of development, Mikami worked on the game entirely alone, only adding people to the team once it became clear what direction he wanted the game to go in. He had written 40 pages of the script on his own and was hand-drawing images of what he wanted the screen to look like at certain points in the game. While the game was still on the SNES, it was meant to be a first-person horror game, heavily inspired by the first-person fight sequences in Sweet Home. This idea was actually prototyped but was inevitably scrapped. Mikami had played Alone in the Dark at some point during development, and he loved the game so much that it convinced him to change to fixed camera angles. Speaking of Alone in the Dark's creator, Frederick Reynal, Mikami says, Without him, Resident Evil would probably have become a first-person shooter. Mikami's main idea for Resident Evil was to make it terrifying. He wasn't scared by ghosts or possessions, things of the ethereal. He wanted real, physical monsters that posed a true threat to the other physical beings that you would inhabit and by extension would pose a threat to the player. While Resident Evil was being built off the back of Sweet Home and other games like it, it couldn't help but be influenced by horror cinema from the period as well. But the main distinguishing factor between this and the horror films of the past was that the locus of control was in the hands of the player and not the director of the film. Mikami ultimately wanted to create a horror game where the player had control, where they did not have to follow the whims of the creator, but where they could choose how to proceed. When Mikami started bringing other people onto the project, he had a team of 40 hands on deck, but Resident Evil wasn't seen as some groundbreaking project that would shatter the company's financial reports. It was just seen as another game. At certain points, people with free time were even directed to help out on the project because they didn't have enough manpower. This team would eventually balloon up to 80 members by the end of development as the project gained more respect and notoriety throughout the studio. Before the launch, many features had to be cut. Late prototypes featured co-op gameplay, real-time weapon switching, and extra areas, all of which were not included in the final build of the game. But with many delays under its belt, a rocky development, and some cut content, Resident Evil was released for the Sony PlayStation 1 on March 22, 1996 in Japan, April 1st, 1996 in North America, and August 16, 1996 in the PAL region. Before we talk about Resident Evil as an experience, we have to talk about Resident Evil as a choice. If you aren't already aware, saying that Capcom likes to re-release their game multiple times and in multiple versions is like saying that Todd Howard is obsessed with having as many copies of Skyrim on the market as possible. It's an understatement. Resident Evil was first released on the PlayStation 1 in 1996. That same year, the game was then released for Windows, with some nominal differences. The introduction was now featured in color rather than black and white, and the uncensored scenes of the Japanese releases of the original PlayStation game were included. 2 new weapons were also added, and alternate costumes. In 1997, the director's cut version of Resident Evil was released for the PlayStation 1. This version included difficulty options, an advanced mode with new item placements, reintroduction of the censorship from the original release, the addition of auto-aim, and new costumes. The same year, the Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil was released. This version had exclusive enemies, an extra boss at the end of the game, more new costumes, and new character models. In 1998, the DualShock PS1 version of Resident Evil was released. This, as you can clearly tell by the name, supported DualShock controller functions like rumble and analog sticks. The only other real difference here from the director's cut was the new soundtrack, which had some questionable choices. In 2002, the game was entirely remade from the ground up for the GameCube. This version of the game is completely overhauled, which I'll talk about more in a later section of this video. In 2006, Resident Evil was released for the Nintendo DS under the title Resident Evil Deadly Silence. This version included reworked puzzles, touchscreen support, new costumes, subtitles, skippable cutscenes, etc. It was actually a huge upgrade. And finally, in 2015, the remaster that was originally released for the GameCube was ported to Windows, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, 4, and Xbox One. Now, all of this information builds to the final surging question: which one of these should you play? And you'd be surprised to realize that this is quite a difficult question to answer. The original PlayStation version of the game lacks quite a lot of the handy features of the director's cut version of the game, but it is the original version of the game, so it was quite appealing to me for my interests in covering this game and this series. I did play this one all the way through. The Windows version of the game also lacks quite a lot of the handy features from the director's cut version of the game, but it does allow you to skip door transitions, which, if unskipped, take up a large chunk of your playtime. It also probably looks nominally better than emulating the original version on PC. I also played this one all the way through. The director's cut version of the game has a lot to like about it. Adjustable difficulty and auto-aim make this feel like a completely different experience, but if you're playing it today, you're probably emulating it on PC, and the gameplay won't hold up quite like the Windows version of the game does. I did not play this one all the way through, but I did experience a good chunk of it. The Sega Saturn version of the game doesn't really have much to write home about in terms of features, and its new character models look far too chunky for my tastes, so that one is off the list. The DualShock PS1 version is, well, yeah, it's just not really worth talking about either. The original version of the remake on the GameCube does have its advantages over the 2015 version in that some of the lighting in the backgrounds is a bit more noticeable, but in my opinion, it doesn't really beat out the modern version in either fidelity or accessibility. Deadly Silence is a massive upgrade for the original version of the game and includes a ton of features that the original doesn't have. That being said, I won't be using much footage from this one as it just doesn't make sense for this video. And finally, the 2015 version of the GameCube remake is probably the best version of this game that exists, and maybe the best remake of a game that I've ever played. All that being said, the main two versions that I selected to take a look at for this video were the original PlayStation version, which I emulated, and the Windows version, which was recently released on GOG and is fantastic. This is because these two were the closest to the original version of the game, unsullied and pure, while still being easy to play and record. I did try out every version for this review so that I could make some sort of informed decision, and in the end, I have my complaints with both the original PS1 version of the game and the Windows version of the game, but much like Resident Evil itself, I think they combine to create a larger canon, a larger whole. I will be talking about the remake at the end of this video, and I would probably recommend it over every version of this game entirely. When booting up Resident Evil, we actually have a choice before we can begin the game. We have to pick between two characters, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. This choice ultimately doesn't matter much because we'll be playing both characters, but there are some differences in the end result. Mainly, Chris's side is a bit more difficult due to the different mechanics, choices, and items, and their stories play out in a slightly different way. We'll start out with Chris and then talk about Jill's side of the story. The year is 1998, the month is July, and the setting is Raccoon Forest. We open on a dark sky full of clouds. In the background, we can hear a narration begin to set the scene. The man speaking is Chris Redfield, who is heading up the search for Bravo Team's helicopter in the forest. Newspaper clippings flash across the scene that tell us strange murders have been happening in Raccoon City, and that STARS, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, were sent to fix the issue. Families were being attacked and eaten by some group, and Bravo Team went to seek them out, but Chris and his team lost communication with them. We begin to see live action shots of the characters in our group as they finally come across the crashed helicopter. As the group finds the bodies of the team they were sent to rescue, they are attacked by mutated dogs. Their helicopter takes off and leaves them stranded as they have to make a run for the nearest safe haven, a mansion hidden among the trees. Now, I'd like to talk about this introduction for a moment. Stating the obvious here, the whole thing is filmed in live action. The first Resident Evil game uses live action footage, most likely accidentally, to add to its campy B-movie style. As we'll find out soon enough, Resident Evil is a game about zombies, influenced by horror films of the past. Movies like Night of the Living Dead lend the basis for the undead premise. Films like Pet Sematary provide the idea for undead animals. The Shining provides the setting. Hitchcock's Birds provides the, well, birds. But in some ways, Resident Evil doesn't feel like those high-class, well-constructed films of its past. It feels like a B-movie. It's kitschy, it's campy, it's definitely corny. Just listen to the way that Chris beckons the helicopter to stay, to not leave them stranded here in this unfamiliar and dangerous place.
No! Don't go!
It's brilliant, and most importantly, it sets a precedent for both story and tone. It's also worth noting that the colorized version of this footage in the Windows version of the game makes everything look even cornier than it already is. This somehow looks like a preemptive cosplay, like actors cosplaying characters that hadn't even been created yet. For the tone of the game, it communicates to the player that this is first a horror story, a tale meant to terrify and scare, but it is also not a story that will be beating you over the head with its messages. Resident Evil attempts to capture a foundational feel very early on that it is creating a very simple framework to set a new experience in. Its foundation borrows from many of its inspirations, but the ways in which it innovates will be in the way that you experience those fears. Resident Evil, as we continue forward, will sort of become this strange crossover amalgamation of the horror genre as a whole. It has the advantage of not being a film and being an interactive experience on its side, though. And Resident Evil is cool. It is not begging you to respect how cool it is, but lackadaisically proving that fact to you by throwing things into your face, like the character introduction sequence. Our cast is introduced to us as if we're about to boot up a mid-90s fighting game, as if Rebecca Chambers and Chris Redfield were about to start duking it out on screen in 2D fashion.
Rebecca Chambers.
But the introduction sequence also sets the precedent for story moving forward. It's quick and simple, but it tells the players that this mansion is our safe haven. While we'll soon learn that this safe haven is not so safe after all, we are effectively trapped here. There is no other way out. The front door, standing for the archetypal image of exit, run, or escape, will not even be present as an option. The mutated dogs outside present a danger too high to overcome, and the lack of chopper means that our heroes must deal with whatever is inside this elegant fortress. The front door is so inaccessible to the player that none of the fixed camera angles will ever even show it, telling us clearly, bluntly, and literally that escape is not an option. With multiple Bravo team members confirmed dead and one of Alpha Team squad making a tasty lunch for the mutants outside, the rest of the group heads into the mansion. Here, in Chris's side of the story, it is Wesker, Jill, and Chris. Chris wonders where Barry has gone, but Wesker notes that he's most likely dead at this point. The group hears a gunshot and Chris is sent off to check it out, while Jill and Wesker stay back. Jill leaves Chris with two final emotional words, even though they don't know it yet. These two won't see each other again for quite some time, and it'll be on the other side of some pretty heavy revelations. The developers know this though, so heavy emphasis is placed on this moment.
Chris, take care.
Chris heads into a dining room off the side of the main entryway and makes his way to a nearby hall. There he finds a monster, specifically an undead zombie, feasting on the remains of one of Bravo team, Kenneth. And upon examining his body, Chris notes that he has become a shadow of his former self. Geez, Chris, that's a little harsh, don't you think? When Chris heads back into the main entryway to report his findings, Wesker and Jill are gone, the woman's pistol left on the ground. This is our first weapon of the game, and the moment that we're given full control, and not only the ability to fight, but to shoot. With this, it's probably time to talk about the gameplay of Resident Evil. The main goal of Resident Evil after this point becomes to find Jill and discover a way out of this mansion. That becomes increasingly harder as over the course of the game we're introduced to many different enemies and threats that act as roadblocks. Resident Evil then provides two ways to interact with its systems, fighting and solving puzzles. We fight enemies mostly with a variety of ranged weaponry. We start out with a pistol, and shooting is as simple as aiming down our sights and pulling the trigger. Aiming is done in the classic fixed camera way by holding the R1 button and then adjusting our aim with D-pad inputs. We can aim up, down, or adjust our aim to the left and right. Though our pistol is effective and has a ton of ammunition scattered throughout the game, the shotgun, which we find later in the story, will provide much desired firepower in exchange for less ammunition overall. The revolver is similar, packing a lot more punch, but having less resources to fire it with. These 3 weapons are basically it for Chris's side of the story. Jill will get an extra weapon that we'll talk about when we get there. There are some other contextual weapons that we'll save for the moments when they're relevant, and some weapons that can be unlocked when the game is beaten. But mainly, these 3 make up the bulk of the fighting that we'll do on our first playthrough. The main enemy type that we'll encounter for a large chunk of the beginning of the game will be zombies. The zombies aren't particularly easy to deal with at the start when we're still getting our bearings. They are slow, lumbering creatures that seem like they don't pose much threat, but this would be a mistake to misjudge them like this. They require quite a few rounds from the handgun to take down, and even when they fall to the floor, that isn't necessarily the end of their fight. Sometimes they will still be alive, and the only way to really get rid of them is to ensure that there's a pool of blood forming around their body. If we leave them on the ground still alive, they could attack our legs as we're walking by. We'll talk about other enemies as they're introduced because that complicates things a bit, but let's keep it simple for now and focus on the undead. They also do quite a bit of damage, and part of the way that we interact with Resident Evil, fighting, is also healing. 2 of the 3 most valuable resources in Resident Evil are ammunition and healing items. Healing items either come in the form of herbs or sprays. A first aid spray is pretty strong and will take our health up from a terrifying, blinking red danger to a calm, reassuring, blinking green fine. The green herbs by themselves will restore a chunk of our health, but when combined with a red herb, their strength will be increased and they will be effectively a first aid spray. The blue herb will cure us if we get poisoned, and the red herb always strengthens the herb it's combined with. It's a pretty simple system, but what's the point of herb combination in the first place? Well, Resident Evil might fool you into thinking that it's a survival horror game with its zombies, guns, fixed camera angles, and overall tone, but it's actually a management simulator. The goal of Resident Evil is to keep the numbers in your inventory and your stash box high while also progressing through the game. It's a delicate balance, and plenty of this work is done through trading with the game as if it were an NPC. Let me explain. Playing as Chris allots the player with 6 inventory slots, a paltry sum of spaces to store the things that we need in this journey. Generally, 2 of these inventory slots are taken up by our currently equipped weapon and a stack of ammunition for that weapon. Luckily, we can store any of the items that we find in stash boxes that are laid out across the mansion. These stash boxes are all interlinked, so an item placed in one stash box will be easily accessible from a stash box on the other side of the house. Inventory space starts to get pretty limited very quickly once we factor in picking up healing items as we come across them, picking up other guns that we find, our ammunition, and especially puzzle items. We'll get to those specifically in a minute, but we require a lot of inventory space, and that does not matter to Resident Evil. We get only 6. The stash box is technically more inventory space, a near infinite amount of it, but it cannot move with us. It stays stationary in different rooms throughout the house. If the stash box was another character in the game, it would be Oscar the Grouch, a permanent fixture of the alley that we inhabit, someone that we are forced to interact with on its terms, but someone that doesn't particularly make life as easy as it could be. And that's not the point. Resident Evil is not a game that's supposed to be as easy as it could be. It's not the most difficult game that I've ever played, but it certainly doesn't pull punches. It could be described as punishing. If it were released today and the survival horror genre made its way without it, then journalists would surely refer to it as the Dark Souls of survival horror games. If you were paying attention, then you will have noticed that I also mentioned a third most valuable resource in the valuable resource hierarchy of Resident Evil. This item would be ink ribbons. Ink ribbons are items that we will find scattered throughout the mansion. They allow us to save our progress at typewriters, devices which are usually included in stash rooms. If we do not have an ink ribbon, we cannot save. You can probably see how this is a pretty important item to have. So Resident Evil doesn't restrict our access to these items. Handgun ammunition is placed in many rooms throughout the game, green herbs and first aid sprays are provided to us often, and ink ribbons are given to us at big moments in the game's narrative. But Resident Evil restricts our ability to keep these items on us. This creates a different dynamic between the player and the systems. We know that we have these items, and if we've collected enough of them, we may have them in abundance, but they might not be on us right now. There are effectively 3 ways to go about this on your first playthrough. You can keep many healing items and ammunition on you to be prepared for moments when you might encounter combat. This might make you deal with these situations better, but it might also make you waste these items, and they are finite. This also will create a longer playtime, because in many cases, you will run into puzzle items that need to be taken back to the stash, creating a lot of running back and forth. Or you can keep the bare minimum, trading more in scarcity, but you run the risk of dying and losing your progress. But this carries the advantage of easily interacting with most puzzles in the game. Because of this, we have to interact with the game by making trades. This is done in various different ways. During combat, we might get hit, and even if we make it out alive of an encounter, this still becomes a dangerous situation. Wandering around the mansion low on health means that we run the risk of dying in the next encounter. So do we play the next encounter safe by using a ton of bullets, risking ammunition waste at the expense of using a health item? Or do we just use the health item? This is trading health items for ammunition. This is also done when inventory space is low and we don't have the slots to carry extra stuff. We make a decision between combat power and safety in health. When running down hallways, we can avoid combat altogether by running past enemies, something we will do quite often. But again, we risk trading health for ammunition. And all of this is in the effort of conservation. Conserving our stores and hoarding what we have is essential because all resources are finite. If we run out of ammo, then we're stuck in that situation and we have to find a way out. Of course, we can always fall back on the old trusty combat knife, but it isn't exactly all reliable. The first time that I booted up Resident Evil, I got about an hour into the game before I realized it actually required you to pay attention to your inventory and your supplies, and had to restart the game because I was in such a bad way. This is something that Resident Evil makes you learn. Like an iron-fisted father, Resident Evil does not bend to you, you bend to it. You warp and fit yourself into its mold in the interests of the overall experience. In an interview with the French outlet Le Monde, Shinji Mikami said, "I was a normal child. That said, my parents were extremely strict. Maybe that's reflected in my games." And this is an understatement because Resident Evil is strict, but this is in the service of horror. Resident Evil has horror in the classical sense that we will talk about. The groaning noises that the undead make, the crows that watch you while you complete the art puzzle, and the giant monsters you must buck up and face. But Resident Evil's horror doesn't stop at its enemies and narrative. The spirit is passed on to the mechanics as well. Making these resource trades, even if done perfectly, can still leave you high and dry. Let's say you fill up your inventory with puzzle items because you think a solution is coming soon. On your way to that area, maybe you only bring a pistol with a few bullets inside to make room for the rest. In this scenario, you are overextended, and because of Resident Evil's unpredictable design, illusions in the dark that make you feel like enemies can appear at any moment, you feel that fear of overextension. You feel bare, you feel naked, you feel left out in the cold. How can you manage to push through these halls when there's the chance that the ammunition you have just won't be enough? It is a more emotional fear, one of inadequacy. Did I get it wrong? Did I prepare myself in a poor way? Did I make a mistake? Reaching your goal with this overextension in mind feels just that more satisfying in the end. You pulled off something that you shouldn't have been able to. You risked it all and made it out the other side the victor. And maybe it was luck, maybe you figured out the system, but maybe you won't take that chance again. In an article for Game Informer, Koji Oda spoke on Resident Evil as he had originally worked on the SNES version of the game before they switched systems. On speaking about the differences between the original product and what the game became, he said, "For example, it was originally set in a place that had nothing to do with reality, more of a hellish place." I'm sure that Oda meant the original environment was more surreal and that it didn't conform to the rules of the real world. I picture flames and demons. But what could be more hellish than being trapped in a place and forced to walk its halls, forced to defend yourself, forced to run your resources ragged, forced to shoot at enemies with no clue if that was the last bullet that you'll ever see? Safe rooms represent a break from this hellish situation. Safe rooms are specifically designed to give you a moment to breathe. You can stash your items, reevaluate what you have and what you will take with you this time. You can also save if you'd like to make that choice, one that must be made with certainty because there is a heft to it. But the music carries most of the emotional and tonal shift in the safe rooms. The thumping piano that carries along with the wistful synths in the background make this track feel like a warm blanket. It does make you feel safe, like you won't be attacked here, but not that you're necessarily being cared for. It's as if two children have taken a break from a play fight. The game is telling us that you can catch your breath, but in a few moments, the game will be back on. This is the underlying implication that the song pushes forward as well. This high-pitched, eerie whine carrying on in the background. It's meant to evoke the unease that we feel here, that there really is no true safety in this house or in this game. There are certain areas in the home that exist as semi-safe rooms, in that monsters will never appear here. The main hall is one of these, and you get pretty used to the fact that when you're out here, you can take a brief break. The other way that we interact with Resident Evil is through puzzles. Other than killing enemies and clearing out hallways, this is our main source of progression. Resident Evil has a design philosophy that could best be described as a relay race, or rather 6 relay races all going on at the same time that converge at different points. We will solve various puzzles throughout the game that all serve a greater purpose. A key will give us access to various rooms in the mansion, but that key is given to us in the service of getting a crest, and that crest is given to us in service of gaining access to another area of the game, and that area contains another key and a crank, and the crank gives us a medal, and the medal gets us up to the lab, and on it goes until we finish the game. This design does keep you engaged in the case that it is as short as Resident Evil 1 is. If it were extended any longer, then it would surely need more story beats and cutscenes to keep you motivated and moving forward, which Resident Evil 1 doesn't have very much of. The puzzles range from very engaging to downright boring. Some of them are so simple that it isn't even worth having a puzzle, but I think most land in the former camp. They tend to require creative solutions from the player, leaving us feeling like we haven't entered a mansion but some sort of labyrinth. This is a feeling that is built on throughout the environment design as well. For the most part though, we spend our few hours in Resident Evil jumping back and forth between fighting and solving puzzles. And the puzzles represent a moment to think. Not to think about items and how much we have left, but to think about this puzzle, the here and now, to be present in the moment. We are stripped away from the anxiety-filled hallways full of monsters trying to eat us alive, and allowed some sort of brief, merciful respite from the hell of the Spencer Mansion. Heading back to the story of Resident Evil, Chris finds Jill's gun and realizes that he now not only needs to find an escape plan, but also reconnect with his compatriots. As he explores the place, he finds a hallway covered in blood and another member of Bravo team dead on a balcony. Forest has been pecked apart by crows, and it's starting to look like this place eats people alive. As Chris arrives in a safe room, he is rudely sprayed in the face by some mystery woman. She apologizes as she mistook Chris for an undead monster and introduces herself as Rebecca Chambers. She was a medic working with Bravo team and escaped into the mansion when they crash landed outside. Rebecca notes that she recently made repairs to the helicopter, but the reason they crashed was due to an issue with the engine. Clearly something else went wrong, but we aren't sure what at this point. Resident Evil's characters are very simple but strong. They are simple because we don't spend too much time hearing them speak throughout the course of the game, and why would we? These people are far too busy fighting for their lives to take the time to chat. There aren't many cutscenes in the first game, which doesn't give us a ton of time to get used to the characters, but their performances and the short bouts of dialogue that we do have leave us with a strong impression of who they are. I challenged myself to describe each of the characters in one word because their personalities really can be summed up this succinctly. I'll read these words to you now. Chris Redfield, brute. Jill Valentine, hero. Barry Burton, liar. Albert Wesker, shady. And finally, Rebecca Chambers, plucky. Most of the characterization comes from the performances, which I do think are good even though they are extremely poorly written. This was mostly due to translation issues during the development of the game. Most of the lines sound awkward, stunted, and odd, but the tone with which these lines are read provides all of the context that you'll need for these characters.
There's nothing else you could have done anyway. It's good you're here.
Yes, sir. But it's strange. I serviced the helicopter recently.
Chris's lines are read as if Superman himself is reading them, straight to the point, but a gung-ho attitude behind the words that he speaks. Rebecca Chambers, on the other hand, is enthusiastic, ready to help, and ready to serve. It is difficult to explain what makes a character like Rebecca Chambers so interesting to me. She immediately became my favorite character in the game. Maybe it's because she feels like a bit of an outsider in this world. She only joined Bravo team recently and is the youngest member of this mansion crew. She isn't quite a grizzled veteran of the force, but is approaching this deeply dark and tragic situation with a brightness that is uncharacteristic of the world around her. Rebecca Chambers is the best character in the first Resident Evil game, and I rest my case.
Right there, that's my bitch.
Rebecca asks if she can help Chris out by exploring the mansion with him, a question which will have rippling effects unbeknownst to us. At first, I assumed this would mean that we would be escorting Rebecca around the mansion, and that was something that I did not want to do. But Rebecca, being the absolute beast that she is, will stay back in this room even if we say yes. Quite the power move, Chambers. Nice job.
That's my bitch.
In a nearby room, we can find a note titled Keeper's Diary. It seems to be written by some sort of guard that was stationed here, who also notes there were researchers working in the building. He was tasked with feeding some sort of creatures that looked like gorillas without skin. After some accident in a laboratory, the guards were told to wear protective suits. The journal quickly degrades as the keeper started to feel a variety of different symptoms. Among these were the symptoms of itchiness and the craving for human flesh, resulting in the long-standing Resident Evil meme, Itchy Tasty. The overarching puzzle for this section of the game is to acquire 4 crests. These crests must be placed in a placard on the terrace outside. This is all in service of unlocking a door to the next area. This crest quest will take us all over the mansion and requires us to find multiple keys that unlock the various doors of this home. Certain doors are marked with swords, which will be opened with a sword key. Others are marked with shields and can be opened with a shield key, so on and so forth. We can kill a living plant in the greenhouse by using a chemical in the fountain's pump. This will give us the armor key. Entering a bar room that contains a large piano will allow us to examine some sheet music. And as Chris attempts to play this musical instrument, we get a startling revelation. Chris can't even read. Oh, he can't read music. That makes sense. Luckily, Rebecca Chambers can read music. We can leave her to learn Moonlight Sonata on the piano, and once she figures it out, she opens a secret passageway nearby.
That's my bitch.
Inside, we can pull out the gold emblem, but this causes the secret door to close behind us. In good old Indiana Jones fashion, we can replace the golden emblem with another lesser valued one from the main hall. We can effectively swap them out, which will give us the shield key. With these things in hand, we can generally solve the puzzles to get the crests, all but one. One crest requires us to destroy a statue and place the blue gem inside into a tiger bust. Another requires that we solve a painting puzzle in the art hall that sees us activating switches underneath portraits, ascending by age. And the third sees us moving some busts onto 2 grates in the armor room before activating a switch. If we don't cover these grates, the room will be filled with poison. While going about these tasks, we can eventually find a shotgun, a weapon that is a massive upgrade from our current Beretta pistol. The shotgun can be taken off the wall in a specific room, but it will activate a trap that will see the house trying to crush us as we leave. This can only be rectified by pulling another old Indiana Jones and replacing the functioning shotgun with a broken one of similar weight. The Resident Evil 1 shotgun is probably one of my favorite guns in a video game, mainly because it is so satisfying to use. First of all, it is foreshadowed quite a bit before we actually get access to it. We can find shotgun shells all over the place, so we know that we'll get it at some point, and we're waiting for that sweet, sweet firepower. But it also breeds anticipation because it means we get to access more ammunition, functionally extending our current supply by double. But when we get it, it surpasses even that anticipation that's been bred for the first chunk of the game. Dealing with zombies becomes particularly easy as aiming up with the shotgun will explode the heads of the zombies that we're fighting. Previously, it would take a random amount of shots to take a zombie down, and even then they could return to fight once again. But if we blast the brain out of these fools, then there's no coming back, and the hallway is effectively cleared in one bullet. Getting a headshot with the shotgun is so satisfying. The noise it makes, the blood spray, the body thunking to the floor. If Resident Evil's goal was to make the player desire violence, then it has done its job and done it well. During one of our excursions into the mansion, we can also find the will of a researcher who was infected and didn't want to live as one of those creatures. Most of the backstory in Resident Evil 1 is delivered through memos like this. The story will eventually come to a head, but the lore is mostly communicated through small notes. This is done far better in the remake, in my opinion. While some of the original memos do provide a slight context to the game, the remake dives into this a bit deeper. Obtaining the 4th crest, though, is our ticket to getting the heck out of this mansion proper. The final crest is actually in an attic room, isolated all by itself. But when we get up there, we're met with a terrifying sight. Richard from Bravo Team has already been killed outside, and when we get into the attic, we are attacked by a giant snake. The snake's name is Yawn, and as you can tell, it is not friendly. We are not really supposed to actually fight Yawn here, we just need to get the crest and get out, but that's a bit tougher than it looks. This is mostly because of how the room is designed and how much space Yawn takes up. But it's not just that we don't want to fight Yawn and possibly die, it's that we don't want to get hit at all, because Yawn has poison in them fangs. If we do get hit during this battle, then Rebecca Chambers will come to the rescue. She will save the poisoned Chris by running to the other side of the mansion and grabbing some serum in the same room that we met her in.
That's my bitch.
We get an entire section where we control Rebecca, running across the house to help out her companion. If we don't get hit during the battle, then this just never happens, which is absolutely insane. This is another great strength of Resident Evil, just how dynamic it is. The game will have multiple endings based on what we do or don't do throughout the course of the story, but little things like this are just massive. You can entirely skip a section where you play your companion just because you did so well in a battle. But it fits, it makes sense. If you didn't get poisoned, there's no reason for this scene. It makes sense within the world and within the rules that the game itself establishes. After Chambers rescues Chris, she tells the big, dumb, musically illiterate brute to be more careful moving forward. And with the final crest, we can now journey through that door that's been locked for quite some time. This door will give way to the courtyard outside, which is filled with mutant dogs, easily one of the most annoying and threatening enemies in the game. Though small and not particularly tanky, they outmaneuver us in just about every way. Here we can use a newly found crank to divert a pool of water in our way. This will give us access to an elevator and a hidden passageway. This passageway leads to a completely different building called the guardhouse. If it wasn't already clear, something was going on at this mansion, something sinister. It wasn't just a home, but some sort of research project, a research project that went south. This guardhouse will present a new set of puzzles, but will ultimately function the same as the mansion, but on a smaller scale. Our goal in the beginning is to get keys that will allow us to access the various regions of the building. These keys are mostly one and done, unlike the mansion keys, which are used for multiple doors. Chris will find a memo in a back room that contains a report on something called Plant 42. After an accident in the lab, one plant began growing at an incredible speed. It was affected by something called the T-virus. The plant's roots have spread throughout the house, and to make matters worse, a scientist broke the water tank in the basement, filling it with water. The plant's roots are in this very same basement and can be targeted there to try and destroy it. The researchers luckily developed some sort of chemical called V-Jolt that can disable these plant roots. Journeying into the basement through a hidden ladder allows us to access the laboratory that the document talks about. It's a cold and dark place, hidden from the outside world. And while the manor did feel distinctly unappealing and terrifying, it also felt like at some point it was a warm place. This lab is, in contrast, very cold and rejecting. It seems as if it has been, and always was, that way. We can venture through the water in the lab to try and drain this place, but a shark is swimming around. Once the water is drained with the flip of a switch, though, this shark becomes a problem of the past as it flops around helpless on the floor. Upstairs, we can find another document on V-Jolt, this substance that will defeat Plant 42. It even provides a list of different chemicals and their colors so that we can identify them. We'll need this shortly, but before that, we enter a nearby door and Chris is captured by Plant 42. Luckily, ever the savior, Rebecca Chambers jumps in to help us. We can then play Rebecca once again as she heads into a nearby chemical storage room to whip up the V-Jolt. This requires us to solve probably my favorite puzzle in the game. V-Jolt is created by combining the various chemicals in this storage room. The formula is actually written on the wall as a simple math problem. We have to combine the chemicals based on this problem, and while it is pretty simple, I actually ended up writing out the formula on paper and plotting it out before I took action. I love when you can easily do this with puzzles in games. It's not required here, but it makes the whole thing feel a bit more real. As Rebecca, we can take the V-Jolt and head downstairs into the basement to apply it to the plant's roots. This doesn't quite kill the thing though, and we still have to defeat it as Chris. This requires unloading a ridiculous amount of bullets into the bulb that I would call its head. Once we destroy it, we can find a nearby helmet key, which is for some doors in the mansion that we were never able to unlock. Heading outside, Rebecca checks on Chris again.
We got to the root of the problem.
She gives us Richard's radio, which she picked up from his body. Brad, the helicopter pilot, has been trying to get in contact with Team Alpha to pick them up, but the radio isn't communicating back to him. Chambers decides to head back to the nearby safe room and whip up a serum. Outside this room, we're reunited with Wesker as he's firing bullets into nearby creatures. Wesker claims he and Jill were attacked and they got split up. He's also determined to complete the mission at hand and tells Chris to head back into the mansion for another once-over. Since we have a new key, we should be able to access previous areas that were closed off to us. When we get back to the mansion, everything changes. Suddenly, we're treated to a first-person cutscene of something stalking the path we just walked. Surely a heinous beast based on the way that it moves, and when it arrives, we have a new type of enemy entirely. These are called the Hunters, and when we first face them, they can be brutal. They lunge towards us, they jump around, they're as fast as the dogs but do more damage, and if we're felled by one of these beasts, they straight up cut our head off. Now, a new enemy type isn't the craziest thing ever, so why exactly does this change everything, as I said before? Well, when we left the mansion, we had been there for a while. We were solving puzzles, we were killing zombies, and slowly over the course of the game, we were getting comfortable. We had started to exert our presence over this physical domain. And when you start to clear out hallways, those hallways suddenly don't become a problem anymore. You aren't afraid of them because there's nothing there. And getting to know the layout means that you're familiar with this place. It's no longer a strange and derelict home, it's the C-shaped hallway, or the art gallery, or the main hall. Not that terrifying room with a bunch of enemies that I avoided. That fear of the unknown that was ever so present at the beginning of the game is completely gone. This makes a return when we leave the manor and head to the guardhouse. We're back into the unknown again, exploring unfamiliar areas and waiting for whatever means to pop out at us from the dark. But when we return to the mansion, we feel a safety oncoming. A sigh of relief is breathed because maybe we'll be exploring new areas, but we're ultimately in a place that we've explored before. We know how to master that place. We know the threats that it holds. So when the Hunters are introduced, I said that everything has changed, Because it has. The hunter presents a new, stronger threat, one that will permeate the house just as the zombies did when we arrived, and we must grapple with that threat once again, learning lessons and going through the painful process of becoming comfortable here. It's as if someone has invaded our home and made themselves comfortable, except this isn't our home and it never was. The new key that we gathered in the guardhouse will allow us to explore previously untrodden areas of the home. Upstairs on the second floor, we can find a top secret note to the head of the security department. They were getting ready for something called X Day. It seems the members of STARS were meant to be lured into the lab. This was for the ultimate purpose of obtaining research data when they would inevitably fight these strange creatures in the house. They wanted embryos of the creatures collected, except for one called the Tyrant, and the lab ultimately destroyed. It was supposed to look like an accident. This order was written by White Umbrella. Journeying throughout the mansion, we can also obtain the revolver by solving the other side of the Tiger Bust puzzle, and finally get a rematch with that Yawn character from before. This time, Yawn attacks in a checker-floored room, and this was the point in the game that I started to really face some adversity, where I really started to make terms with the strictness of Resident Evil. Yawn is not a mechanically complex boss battle. We will run to opposing sides of the room and fire rounds into the snake as it stalks us across the area. When it gets close, we must dodge its attacks and pump more bullets into it. If we are hit too many times, then Yawn will consume Chris whole. Now, my failure was in terms of preparation. I hadn't brought enough healing items with me and was generally low on health, making this fight harder than it needed to be. But it made me learn a lesson within the Resident Evil framework, that if combat is pulled off with some sort of mastery, some sort of proficiency, then trading can be completely wiped out. If you don't get hit, you won't lose health. It's easier said than done, but I basically forced myself to complete this battle without losing health. I tried it many times over and over, and some of the difficulty here comes from the tank controls of the time. This is solely because Yawn himself does not have to adhere to the same rules as us. He can slither about unhindered by the restrictions of the PlayStation 1 controller. It's not a bad fight by any means, but I still hate Yawn with all my heart, and I was happy when he died. Once we defeat the beast, we can now crawl into the hole that he made in the floor when he first attacked us. This will lead us to a gravestone, which conceals a ladder underneath. Here we gain access to another underground passage, which eventually wraps back into the house itself. This allows us to use the elevator and eventually find a room that overlooks a nearby helipad. This becomes the end goal for our mission, both a way to escape and to contact the other members that we've lost. Nearby, we can find newspaper reports from the Raccoon Times. These articles detail people being attacked outside of Raccoon City by what seemed to be animals at the time, but were probably mutated beasts from this lab. Once we get access to a battery in the mansion, we can leave again and head back to the courtyard. Here we can activate another elevator that allows us to enter the lower part of the courtyard without diverting the water, revealing another underground section of this winding maze. This section seems to be less official and mostly carved out of rock. Pretty quickly, we'll find Enrico down here, the captain of the Bravo Team squad of STARS. Our time with him is very brief, as he quickly suggests that Chris has double-crossed the team before being shot and killed by someone in the shadows. Clearly, someone is covering up what's happening here, possibly someone from within STARS themselves. We can navigate these tunnels a bit further, and we eventually get our second full boss battle of this game with Black Tiger. I'd just like to quickly point out here that I'm not a big fan of spiders, and I can imagine that the animals chosen to be mutated in this game were based on the fact that they rank pretty highly on lists of people's biggest fears. A snake, a spider, and a shark so far. There's another section in the guardhouse where we are first introduced to a smaller version of the spider's enemy. These things are obviously still huge and crawl on the walls with a thunking sound, and this was the trial that Resident Evil had specifically for me, to face these monstrous beasts, ones that I have feared for nearly my entire life, and get through it, grin and bear. And this is part of why Resident Evil is so punishing, because its systems never flinch and never waver. They force the player to conform, beaten down like a piece of hot iron over time. There's a horror in being beaten down, one that's a bit less obvious and more subtle than the monsters and scares. But though I was biting my cheeks and it required many attempts, I beat the Black Tiger, and I was happy when he died. Just before the fight with the spider, we get access to a flamethrower, but quickly must place this weapon back after leaving, because it's needed to open a door moving forward. This is a temporary item, one that would be too powerful if the player was allowed to use it for the end sections of the game. While exploring the mansion and these underground tunnels, we can find 2 books. These books have medals hidden inside, and these are our tickets to the final area of Resident Evil, the laboratory. We can also collect some MO discs on the way. Their purpose isn't clear when collecting them, but we know it must be important. The medals open a massive secret elevator in a fountain, which then leads to a ladder taking us even deeper into this mystery facility. When we get down there, we find a lab that's been overrun with the undead. It seems that this is where the experiments originated, and where the accidents that we've heard about happened. We can find a note downstairs from one of the researchers. He had written the note to his daughter, Ada. The note was sort of his last will, his last words to his daughter as he realized that he was infected. This note becomes a part of a puzzle when he gives us the codes to the door locks around the facility. The goal in the lab is ultimately to get power to the elevator, but there's a lot more that we can do as well. First, we can find some slides downstairs that can be placed in a projector on the first floor. These detail the different experiments that this company, named Umbrella, were involved in. They were mutating animals with some sort of virus and creating biological weapons. But the real shocker here is that Wesker himself was involved. After the accident, the facility's security had been completely wiped out, and they had to ensure that no outsiders would get their hands on the research data. They were concerned about STARS interfering and the press leaking the information to the public, so a cover-up was in store. Obviously, this didn't go the way that Umbrella had planned, and if we make it out alive, their goals would be thwarted. While we're in the lab, we can access 3 separate rooms that contain password generators. We can place the MO discs in these machines to get 3 passwords that will give us entry to the holding cells down here. This will spit out 3 different Bible verses, specifically Genesis 22:16-18. This is God's covenant with Abraham and could reference what the researchers were trying to do here, attempting to make a new type of offspring, not a son as Abraham had in this chapter, but a strange, twisted type of offspring. Gathering one of the MO discs and turning on power to the elevator will require us to head into the mechanical part of the lab. Full of pipes and churning machines, this place is also plagued with our final enemy type. These are the Chimera, a offspring between human DNA and that of a fly. They are grotesque, fast, and fearsome. I tried to avoid them at all cost. Once we gather all 3 passwords, we can finally head to the cells where we find Jill being held. This is what our goal was from the beginning, to find her, and here she is, trapped on the other side of a door, inaccessible. We'll have to head to the end of the game before we can actually rescue her, but it's time to take this thing the whole way. As we head to the elevator, Rebecca Chambers shows up. Wouldn't have it any other way. The elevator takes us down into the lower levels where Wesker is already waiting for us with a gun pointed towards Chris. Chris confronts him about being a part of Umbrella. Wesker admits to being a part of the organization, but it seems that he's actually working for himself. Wesker ends up shooting Rebecca, and now he's gone too far. He takes Chris into the next room and shows him prime stock that Umbrella has been developing. A massive monster floating in a tube full of fluid, a powerful being, the Tyrant. Chris laughs at the failure that they've created, and in an attempt to prove him wrong, Wesker frees the beast. It breaks out, heading for Chris, but ultimately switching his target to Wesker at the last second, and effectively killing his creator. We of course then have to fight the thing. It's ultimately a very simple boss battle because this won't be the last one. It's a bit of a fake out, so when you work up to this point, you're kind of disappointed. A resounding feeling of that was it, but the game hasn't played its last card yet, and in its final moments, Resident Evil will laugh in our face and loudly proclaim, no, that was definitely not it. Once we take down the Tyrant, we can leave its body behind with Wesker's and make a break for the exit. Or as Chris puts it in the next scene,
How about Captain Wesker?
He is sleeping with the ultimate failure.
Rebecca meets us in the hallway. As it turns out, she was wearing a bulletproof vest. When we take the elevator back upstairs, she tells Chris that there's a ton of research in this lab on the Tyrant virus. In an effort to destroy this research, she thinks they should blow the place up and kill the virus here and now. We send her off to do this, and since the emergency alarms have begun to turn on, the door locks are released. This means that we can go rescue Jill, who follows us up to the helipad. On the way, we get a final call on our radio from Brad. He's about to run out of fuel and will be leaving if he doesn't get any response from survivors. We have to get some sort of sign to him soon. As Rebecca turns on the self-destruct sequence in the lab, we have 3 minutes until detonation. Monsters begin to swarm our location, and Rebecca and Jill hold them off while we head to the helipad. Up there, we can set off a signal flare to alert Brad, but the tyrant bursts through the floor at the last minute, and we have to fight him. This is our final battle of the game. We have only moments left, and we need to destroy this thing. We don't actually have to fight it with our weapons, we just need to survive long enough for Brad to drop down a rocket launcher from the helicopter, and 1 round does the mutated beast in. This is easier said than done though, because the tyrant is now much faster, much angrier, and much more aggressive. He will do swiping attacks, charge attacks, and is just much better than we are. We can run him in circles and negate some of these attacks, but we must be very precise. Once we put an explosive round in this thing though, it is destroyed, and we get one final live action sequence as the entire base explodes and our heroes fly off into the sunset, a happy ending ahead of them. There are multiple outcomes for the end of the game that depend on what choices we make throughout the game. By making various choices with Rebecca, she can actually die in a variety of ways. She will then not be present in this final scene. We can also get the worst ending, not saving either of the girls and just leaving Chris to have a lonely helicopter ride himself. These variations are present with Jill's side of the story as well, which we should probably talk about now. Jill's intro is largely identical to Chris's, that is until we get to the mansion. Instead of Chris, Jill, and Wesker being present when they get in the house, it's Jill, Wesker, and Barry Burton. They're looking for Chris, who has already arrived in the mansion but quickly has gone missing. They hear shots in the distance, and Wesker sends Barry and Jill to investigate. Barry finds some blood nearby, and Jill ends up discovering the monster eating Kenneth. Luckily, Barry helps us with the monster and kills it without us having to waste any ammo. Jill's playthrough is actually far easier than Chris's and could just be straight up described as the easy mode of the first game that technically doesn't have a difficulty setting. This is for a few reasons. One is because Barry helps us quite a lot like this throughout the playthrough. Another is that Jill gets access to various weapons earlier on and also has the grenade launcher towards the beginning of the game, which I'm sure you can imagine is very effective at taking down all manner of beasts. She also gets 2 extra inventory slots, which makes a hell of a difference when picking up items and managing the things on your person. It does seem like Jill can take slightly less hits than Chris, but ultimately it becomes a much easier experience overall. After the two deal with the zombie and head back into the main hall, they find Wesker to be missing. The two decide to search for their new missing team member, and Jill gets a lockpick. This also makes the playthrough infinitely easier because a lot of the doors that required keys previously can now just be unlocked natively. And why does Jill get a lockpick and Chris gets nothing? Well, because she's the master of unlocking, silly.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
The general beats of most of the story are relatively still the same. We still have to play the piano, which Jill can do herself instead of needing Rebecca to do it for her. We still have to complete many of the same puzzles and hit the same notes overall. The main and obvious difference here is that we're working through this mansion with Barry instead of Rebecca. Big downgrade if you ask me. Barry isn't that bad of a character, and I actually do think he develops a bit more over the course of the story, rather than Rebecca, who stays pretty flat most of the time. Barry is also a lot more present in Jill's story than Rebecca was in Chris's. Rebecca pops up a few times here and there, but it seems like Barry is just always around. He's there with us for the intro, he appears when we find Forrest's body on the balcony, he appears when we solve a puzzle in the researcher's room of the mansion. One of the big differences in Jill's story is that Richard is still alive when we reach the Yawn fight. We can run and take the serum to him, but he dies anyways and gives us his radio. So I guess it isn't such a big difference after all. When Jill eventually gets to the guardhouse, she overhears Barry talking to someone in one of the rooms. Her suspicions are raised, but when she confronts him about this, he just says that he's starting to lose it and must have been talking to himself. This, of course, raises the player's suspicions about Barry, but Jill just thinks Barry is going a little nutty. There's no way that he could be working for the other side and trying to thwart our every move. Nah, Barry's just a wacky guy. Jill also has a fight against Plant 42, but instead of getting captured by the thing and needing her companion to come help her, she can just make the V-Jolt herself and defeat the thing alone. She meets Wesker in the same way that Chris does after fighting the plant and heads back to the mansion. Jill beats Yawn and eventually gets access to the underground where she meets Enrico. Enrico doesn't suspect Jill is the traitor though. He tries to tell them about the mole in their operation, but is similarly killed before he can tell them who. I'd also like to quickly note here that it is genuinely sad when one of your companions dies. Like I said before, if you make the wrong choices, your partner just won't make it through to the end, affecting which sequence you get at the finale. But seeing them succumb to the mansion is just a really harrowing ordeal, especially because there really isn't a way to get them back without reloading or starting over. Barry, in particular, uses his dying words to make sure that his family is all right, and even gives us a photo of them. It's brutal. She eventually gains access to the lab and finds Chris, who is now placed in the cell instead of her, and promises to get him out. When we get to the final confrontation, Barry reveals that the strange things he's been up to have not come from the source of his wacky brain, but Wesker's machinations. Wesker has been blackmailing him, threatening his family if he didn't help out his plans. So Barry is a bit more three-dimensional here than we originally thought. He isn't someone who is necessarily plotting against us because he's in on the whole thing with the bad guys, he's just trying to save his family. And Wesker is actually killed by him in this side of the game instead of being killed by the Tyrant. I do think this ruins Wesker's death a little bit more. I'd say that I like him being killed by the Tyrant more than a death by Barry's gun. Barry ends up surviving the fight. We rescue Chris and have a similar face-off with the Tyrant on the helipad. If we rescue everyone, then Chris, Jill, and Barry all ride off into the sunset with a happy ending ahead of them. I would say that I probably enjoyed Jill's side of the game more than Chris's overall. Jill's side has the better story in a general sense. While I do like the characters of Chris Redfield and Rebecca Chambers more, they are basically just two do-gooders who want to save the world. It's two people just going, yeah, this is bad, we should fix it. You're right, this is bad, let's fix it. Which is certainly fun, but doesn't carry the depth that the other side does. In Jill's side, our companion is double-crossing us, working for the other side and ensuring that these beasts and mutations are kept under wraps. He's working for Wesker, the big bad of this entry, but Barry is ultimately redeemed when he decides to take Wesker out anyways, and when we find out he was doing things for the right reasons. The original Resident Evil game is a fantastic start to this long-running and incredibly in-depth series. It does horror in the best way that you can do horror, by not only trying to actively scare the player, but letting fear and terror become natural emotions that are organically produced by the system that players interface with. Horror grows in this game like a plant or a virus. It begins to take over the host until it's the only thing left. And the game, or the developers, nurture this fear over the course of the game to ensure that it stays at a maximum for the length of the game's runtime. It has its downsides, of course. The story is incredibly sparse in this entry, with only a handful of documents and cutscenes. The story just doesn't have much there overall, which is fine for this type of thing, when the atmosphere and horror were really the main focus, but it does bring it down a few notches. The story that is there is also pretty poorly translated, so even when we do get a lot, it doesn't really punch. The ambiance of Resident Evil carries the most weight though. The soundtrack is perfect for this project. It feeds back into the control that the developers have over the player. Every track is masterfully crafted for the scene that is being set. The first floor mansion sound that plays as we walk around the ground level of this massive house is probably going to be stuck in my head forever. This is from hearing it so much, but it's also because the long droning noises reek of anticipation. Not of anticipation in the items you might receive or finishing the game, but what's around the corner. The Meeting Rebecca track feels like it's ripped straight from a JRPG. Its light synths glitter across the speakers, ensuring that you know this is a friend, this is someone bright, this is help. The underground track is so open and terrifying, it feels as if ancient creatures emanate these noises, mouths open, pushing waves of audio at you, thrumming and powerful. It tells us that we are in a place that we are not supposed to be. Resident Evil is great at communication with the player. It tells the player everything it needs to know, and it uses every medium it can to do this. Even the transition screens between rooms, the slowly opening doors that hide the load times of the systems, evoke a feeling. It is a breath, a moment. It properly communicates the feeling of opening a door. What is on the other side of that door? We don't know, but we're about to find out. It's the fear of potential, the potential that there's 2 or 3 dangerous creatures that we'll have to fight, and hey, we're low on ammo. Or the potential that there's an empty room where we might relax and breathe. But these 3 to 4 seconds in between rooms gives us time to prepare for that and stew on what could be. It's horror that is carefully and masterfully crafted to meet the player's needs, but also feels organic, like it has been grown rather than built from the ground up. But don't be fooled, the developers of Resident Evil are puppet masters. They control the scene, they control the narrative, and you are a pawn. The game's genius lies in its simplicity though. It's very efficient, very tight in design. There's not a lot of fat here to be cut off. The word bloat and Resident Evil 1 would never be caught in the same room together, let alone the same planet. Because if anything, this game could have a bit more added to it and work just fine. And it wouldn't really be fair to talk about Resident Evil 1 without talking about its legendary remake. After a few years of porting the game to different systems, releasing a few more main entries and spin-offs, Resident Evil 1 would be officially remade. The Resident Evil remake was released for GameCube systems on March 22, 2002 in Japan, April 30th, 2002 in North America, September 13th, 2002 in the EU, and September 20th, 2002 in Australia. The game was later ported to the Wii in 2008 and eventually remastered for near all systems in 2014 and 2015. For this review, I played the remastered version of the remake that was released on Steam. This version is effectively the same as the original, and the only difference that I could really find was that the original GameCube version had slightly different lighting in the backgrounds. Regardless, Resident Evil Remake is one of the best remakes that I have ever played, and I don't say that lightly. I generally don't enjoy remakes. I think that remakes are a last resort if an audience genuinely wants to play a game, but the original version is so inaccessible to them that it must be done. Most games that are made do not actually need remakes, and those remakes that do get made end up feeling like a downgrade of the original project. The Resident Evil remake is the only remake I've ever played that I felt was genuinely faithful to the original game and took liberties to update the design where it could. It is actually one of the better survival horror games that I have ever played. So what exactly has changed? Well, first of all, the remake completely overhauls the graphics of the original game, bringing it in line with 6th generation consoles. And it looks insane. Even with the GameCube non-remastered version of the game that came out in 2002, it looks like this game came out a few years ago. Even in the 2015 version, it looks like it came out a few years ago, and it's almost a decade old. There's proper lighting in the mansion now, the textures look fantastic, everything is beautiful here. But the remake also greatly redesigns the mansion as a whole. It keeps the general layout, but adds new rooms, adds interconnectivity, and changes things around, making this whole thing feel fresh. The game has the same bones as the original, the same foundation, but where the original game felt like a 2-story home in a cul-de-sac, the remake feels like a McMansion. The structure and the way that we go about things is changed around as well. There's more scenes overall. The story is extended a bit and things are given proper context. Rebecca, for example, is characterized much better and plays her role as a medic rather than just sort of helping out where she can. The performances are all redone as well, which leaves the game feeling more like a full project rather than a mistranslated mess. The game starts to feel like it has a genuine and real story behind it. We'll talk about how the story has changed in a moment, but let's go quickly over the gameplay differences. While Resident Evil 1 was slightly difficult, Resident Evil Remake has upped the difficulty quite a bit in making the game a new experience. It does have difficulty settings, so I guess compared to the OG, it can actually be easier if you want it to be, but taking into account the difficulty settings in something like the director's cut, it's definitely harder. This is primarily due to the new additions in the mechanics department. We're notified by a note at the beginning of the game that the only way to defeat zombies are to destroy their head or to burn their body. And while you may read this and shirk off this information with a gruff, "I know what I'm doing," if you've only played Resident Evil 1, then trust me, you definitely do not know what you're doing. Defeating zombies is now not as simple as shooting them over and over until they fall to the ground and ooze out a pool of blood. You must now literally destroy their head or burn their body. Destroying their head can be done with a shotgun like in the original, and you can even get lucky with the pistol, but these seem to happen far less. You can burn the bodies as well by carrying a flask on you with kerosene inside. This flask only takes 2 charges though and must be filled in safe rooms. Also, if you're using Chris, then you have a permanent lighter that doesn't take an inventory slot. If you're playing as Jill though, then carrying around a lighter and flask can be quite cumbersome. This in and of itself doesn't seem like that big of a deal. So what if the zombies come back to life after I take them out? I can always just avoid them, right? Well, in our remake, it's not that simple. These bodies, if left unattended to, will turn into Crimson Heads. Crimson Heads are a different kind of zombie that are much faster, much tankier, and much more dangerous. It is a huge pain in the ass to even fight one of these things, and will probably cost you a decent amount of health items and ammo that you don't need to spend. So it's definitely in your best interest to avoid creating more of them at all costs, because when you get one and you don't deal with it, that room just becomes a place that you don't want to return to anymore. You might be plotting out your route and you'll go, "Oh no, I have to go through there. There's a Crimson Head in there." And suddenly you have to plan around it. It becomes another element that you have to think about, that you have to plan for, that you have to deal with. Resident Evil Remake levels out the playing field for the increased difficulty a bit by giving us defensive items. These are items that don't take up any inventory space, but when equipped, will be automatically used to defend ourselves against attacking foes. If a zombie was about to take a juicy bite out of our human skin, and we have a dagger equipped, for example, then we would take no damage and Chris would stab it in the head. This usually isn't enough to kill the thing on its own though, and will require some more firepower to finish the monster off. Chris also has access to flashbangs, which he will shove instinctively into the mouths of the zombies, and shooting them will result in a head explosion, ensuring no crimson heads here. Obviously, these defensive items are finite, and using them at distinct points is incredibly important. All of these things, including the fact that the mansion has been expanded to include new areas and puzzles, add depth to the original game. It removes the advantage of simplicity that the first game had by taking new chances, but those chances pay off well. The game also makes quite a bit of changes to the story of the original game, but it does so in the most faithful of ways. One of the biggest additions to our remake is the Trevor family. Throughout the course of the game, we will find notes from George Trevor, a New York architect. Trevor was hired by Oswell E. Spencer, the owner of the mansion that the game takes place in. He built the mansion for Spencer and filled the place with traps and puzzles to deter invaders, which in a weird roundabout way kind of explains the puzzles that we solve throughout the game. It's sort of like a 14-year-old's idea of a mansion. When you're a kid, you think someday you'll become a millionaire and build obstacle courses that people have to solve to get into your house. We eventually learn that Trevor's family was kidnapped, assumingly by Umbrella, and experimented upon. His wife was killed in the experiments, but his daughter, Lisa Trevor, was not given the mercy of death. Umbrella's experiments turned her into a monster that still dwells on the premises today. We encounter her at various points throughout the game and eventually fight her in a boss battle with either Wesker or Barry, depending on whose side of the story we're playing. It's a terribly tragic story overall, and seeing Lisa hurl herself into a chasm with her mother's skull at the end of the fight is just heartbreaking. We're put in a terrifying position where we actually empathize with the thing that is trying to kill us. These additions add a significant chunk of substance to the game and actually makes the story feel fuller than it did before. Rebecca and Barry are both fleshed out more as characters too. Barry's arc, while good in the original, is lended more credibility here. Barry is seen as a bit more sympathetic by the end of the story, and the Tyrant ends up delivering the final blow on Wesker, giving Barry his retribution, but also giving Wesker the comeuppance he got on Chris's side of the original tale. Rebecca is no longer just a happy-go-lucky young member of Bravo Team, she's now layered, she's stressed, and she's hiding that with an enthusiasm. The weight of this world and the situations at hand are weighing on her, but she puts on a brave face for those around her.
That's my bitch.
Wesker's motivations are also a bit more clear, that he was puppeteering the STARS members and he only gave them up because the virus got out. The game is still very goofy though, and pays great homage to the original game. It never takes itself too seriously and plays into the whole B-movie aesthetic that the first game had. And the game's story overall just hits those same beats that it did before. We generally fight the same bosses, find things out in the same places, eventually destroy the Tyrant on the roof of the building, and fly off into the sunset. Resident Evil Remake is a remake that genuinely respects the first game. It understands what worked about that game and doesn't try to change it, but to fix the mistakes that were made originally. While I wouldn't recommend that every single person watching this video go play the original Resident Evil or even the director's cut, I would recommend that you go play the Resident Evil Remake. If you are at all a fan of survival horror, it will not disappoint in the slightest. It is quite easy to get lost in the legacy of Resident Evil, to look at the game for what it has become rather than what it is. The game is incredibly simple when taking an overview perspective. You run around a house, shoot zombies, and collect items. That's about it. But the things that we do not represent the experience. It isn't in the mechanics that are here or light story, it's in the execution of these things. It's how the mechanics are implemented. It's how they are combined with the design of the mansion. It's how the mansion twists back into the horror. And I keep coming back to this point, but horror finagles its way into every part of this game. Surprisingly, Resident Evil 1 isn't that scary. These two statements seem counterintuitive, but I would say that the remake is a genuinely scary game, while the original Resident Evil is anxiety-inducing. There's a fear there, but it manifests as tension. And there's a lot to not like about Resident Evil, especially if we're talking about the original version of the game. The load times between rooms are long, the experience can be quite a bit clunky and seem unfair at times, and its story leaves a lot to be desired. It's a fun ride, but not quite an impactful one outside of its mechanics. It is very much carried by the design of its systems. The menus, the items, the way that we use them, the balance, all of these things end up carrying the game to be something more than the rest of it. And the original Resident Evil does have something that the remake doesn't, and that is something a bit harder to put your finger on. It's just a general feel. The atmosphere and vibe of the original Resident Evil is unmatched by the remake. It's not something that you'd probably ever point out or be upset at its removal, but it is gone. The original just has a feeling that's very hard to match. Maybe it's the overlit mansion, maybe it's the pre-rendered backgrounds, maybe it's the pixelated models, maybe it's the sound effects or the awful performances. It's probably some combination of all of these, and the lack of this in the remake is not a negative mark. It's not something easily replicated. So difficult, in fact, that they were probably better off not trying. I mean, look at what they made without it. But in a boxing match between the original Resident Evil and its remake, hey, at least it gets one round. Resident Evil was positively received by critics on release, most praising its sound design, horror, and mechanics, and it was even better received by audiences. The game was a bestseller in just about every region it released. By the end of 1997, the game had sold somewhere around 4 million copies. This reception would cause Capcom to return to the series time and time again, and would create one of the largest franchises in gaming. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye now.